Leftover Masters. We're doing another episode today. We have some leftover steak in the fridge, so we're gonna make some beef stroganoff out of that. Let's go to the fridge. Okay, as I mentioned, we had grilled this weekend, so we have some leftover steak. And leftover steak, I think, is perfect for a dish like this. We're also going to be needing sour cream, Worcestershire sauce. I already pulled our mushrooms and onions and got those just kind of ready because I didn't want to take time to clean those up. And I think that might be all we need for right now. So I'm going to start. I got some butter ready because we're going to do some sauteing. Typically, if you're making this dish fresh, you're going to do the meat first. And most of the time you would put the raw meat into flour and then fry it so it gets kind of a crispy rind on that. That's not something you really want to do with something that's been cooked already. So I'm just going to get my garlic sauteing here. And in the meantime, I'll get the onions and mushrooms ready for that as well. And I'm okay to leave these kind of on the big side. This onion calls for this recipe calls for one medium onion, and my medium onion was pretty tiny, so that's why I have two. So I want to let my garlic cook for a little bit before I get the onions in there. And then mushrooms, same deal. I cleaned these already just so I could spare you the tedious, sort of boring look of that. And I also trimmed off the bottom stem. So we'll just slice these. My kids are not big mushroom fans. So the recipe that I chose today calls for a pound of mushrooms, but I'm just using half a pound. My wife and I will probably end up eating all of the mushrooms, and the kids will probably end up picking theirs off. But they had, I think, a nice texture. And I don't actually think they add a whole lot of flavor to the dish. And I'm using baby bellas, but you could use anything. You could use canned mushrooms if you had to. Certainly just some plain old button mushrooms would work as well. Again, Leftover Masters is all about making do with what you've got. And don't apologize. It is what it is. All right, so we've got that all ready to go. So I'm gonna get my onions going. Use tons of butter for this. Well, not tons, 4 tablespoons, but plenty of butter to get these nice and sauteed. I usually let these saute for a few minutes. In the meantime, I'm also going to get my water going. Because we're not cooking the steak, it's already pretty much cooked. We're just going to slice it up and throw it in. Might as well get the water going because cooking the noodles might be the rate limiting step. And I just don't want to burn my garlic, so that's about the only thing, is to keep an eye on that. Most of the time people would saute their onions a little bit before throwing the garlic in, but as long as you don't have the heat on too high, you don't have to worry about it. So again, this is already cooked, and I think this tastes the best. if it's sliced really thin. So I slice it, it almost gets a little crispy when that occurs, and then real tender too. The original recipes often called for this meat to be cubed, but I would say most recipes nowadays that you see online or in cookbooks call for it to be sliced really thin. So we're going to take the time to do that. Tastes good. In the meantime, we've got our garlic going, our onions and mushrooms. I'm just going to take a minute to check on those. So this dish, beef stroganoff, is named after a Russian family. So the Stroganoffs were a very influential family for hundreds of years, literally hundreds of years, in the 1500s up until the time of the Communist Revolution. So it is theorized that whoever they had cooking in their home, probably a very famous French chef, invented this recipe. So that's why it carries the name beef stroganoff or beef a la stroganoffs. So either way, that's where it gets its name. And you will find many, many, many variations of the recipe online or in cookbooks. So this has mushrooms classically and onions classically, but sometimes people will add peppers. You can alternate various different cuts of meat as well. But typically some kind of flank steak or something like that is what you would normally use for that. So now we'll get our meat in there. Mostly cooked, but this is cooked to probably about medium or even medium rare. So we're going to want it cooked further than that, cooked all the way through. So I'm going to go ahead and get that in where it can. Okay, we're getting our meat cooked down. This is starting to look really good. It's starting to smell really good too. So I want to take a minute and talk about pepper. So while that was going, I did add our Worcestershire sauce and got that in so that flavors from that can simmer in while it's cooking. I'm going to turn it down a little bit just because I want to chat for a while just about pepper. So looking at this, we've got a bunch of different peppers out here. So this is kind of your typical pepper in a can, ground who knows when. Says best if used by 3/19. Well, that was like a year ago, so this has been sitting in our pantry for a while. We typically would use a pepper mill with actual peppercorns. So this is what our go-to is. The only thing about this is that even when you have it on a very coarse setting, it still comes out pretty fine. This recipe calls for cracked pepper, so this is what cracked pepper looks like. And this has amazing flavor. The only thing about that is that there's not a lot of cracked pepper out there to buy. So I usually take our peppercorns and just crack those ahead of time. I was just going to show you a little easy way to do that in case you want to try this at home. Ziploc baggie so you don't make a mess. Leave a little bit of the baggie open just so you can push air out. And then earlier to make this, I found a coffee cup that just has a very flat bottom, and that is what I use to do my cracking. And this doesn't take a long time, and for a dish like this where the cracked pepper is being used for a garnish, I think it's worth it because it's really quite a different flavor than if you were to just put pre-ground pepper in or peppercorns that you put in your pepper mill. So for this recipe, I'm gonna take a little time to do this. You can use any flat surface, and there's a lot of different techniques out there. I think this one seems to work pretty good, and it contains everything. Okay, and then you've got your finished product. So this is pretty well cooked through. Now it just needs to cook in the broth, and we'll kind of cook that down into a bit of a reduction. So I'm gonna go ahead and put my beef broth in. This recipe calls for 2 cups. Or you could substitute some white wine for half a cup of that. And then we'll just let that cook through. But I don't really like wine all that much and the flavor. So I just use all of mine as beef broth. So true confessions. This is my beef broth, which is bouillon cubes. And this is super cheating. You can find canned beef broth. If you wanted to, you can make your own. Honestly, I can't tell the difference. I think this stuff tastes good. I think really good cooks would probably just shudder at the idea of using a bouillon cube. But again, it's easy, they're cheap, they sit on the shelf forever, and I like to use them, so it is what it is. So we'll let that cook down, and then eventually we'll just thicken that a little bit. Add a little bit of sour cream, we'll be ready to go. So now we're just waiting for our noodles to boil. So these are interesting noodles, which I haven't really used before, so I'll be excited to see how they turned out. But we're in the middle of this COVID virus epidemic, and it's amazing how empty the shelves are. So if you go to the grocery store to buy wide egg noodles, you can hardly find any pasta. So this is nesting pepperdil pasta. So this will be really exciting to see how this cooks down. First time I've ever used it, but I think it'll be amazing. You could use rice, you could use various other types of grains, so it doesn't really matter, but like I said, we'll see how this cooks down and serves up. So I'm going to take some of our cracked pepper and add that in so it can cook in, and then some of it we'll just have available as a garnish as well. So alright, so we're going to add our nests of noodles. Check on this. This is cooking down nicely. Very peppery, smelling good. So I'm a big fan of pretty much any kind of pepper. So I'm really excited about this dish. So we're just gonna kind of look at getting our noodles done here. And I like to get these cooked to al dente, which basically means almost done, but not quite. When I was in college, we used to use the old stick test with spaghetti. Where we would take a piece out and we'd throw it up against the wall, and if it stuck, it was done. So this is generally frowned upon once you get married. So I just use the taste test. Not quite done here. Sauce. Sour cream. Now you can use Greek yogurt for this. but I think sour cream is a little bit more authentic. So the recipe calls for 1/2 cup. So we'll just kind of eyeball that. And you don't want to cook this a lot, so this kind of gets stirred in towards the end just to make it a really nice creamy sauce. So that's why you wait till everything is pretty much done. And I'm gonna let this cook down just a little bit more too, because I want it just a little bit thicker. I'm cooking this dish and serving it on noodles. So one of the things I was noticing was my sauce is just a little bit on the runny side. And I think that would be okay if you were serving it over rice, because we kind of soak in there. But I want it to more sit on top and be kind of thicker. And if you remember way back at step 1, because we were using leftover steak, we didn't bread the meat before we cooked it. So I think the recipe was missing a little bit of that flour. So all I did here was take a little bit of our broth base out, and I stirred in some flour and then I put it back in, and that really worked well to kind of thicken things up. So now we got it where we want it. That's basically done. So we're ready to serve and drain our noodles. All right, so those cooked down great. Nice wide noodle. Make sure everything is drained out so we don't get too watery. Put that in our serving dish. And then we'll just throw a little bit of that cracked pepper on top as a garnish. Okay, thanks again for joining us on Leftover Masters. And a very simple dish, less than a half hour of cooking time actually, so went pretty quickly. We took some grilled steak, turned that into beef a la stroganoff, so completely different taste, completely different flavor than what we had for dinner the other night, so it should be exciting to try. So thanks again for joining us on Leftover Masters, and we will hopefully see you next time. If you like our show, continue to follow us on Instagram or check us out on YouTube.